I woke up at 4 a.m. in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel off Route 9, and for a second I forgot where I was. Then I felt the steering wheel pressed against my knee, smelled the mildew from the old blanket I'd pulled out of the trunk, and remembered everything. 58 years old, a retired electrician with 31 years of union work behind me, and I was sleeping in a 2009 Ford F-150 because my daughter had told me, through a closed front door, that I wasn't welcome in her home. Her exact words were, "Dad, Kyle and I talked about it. We just can't do this right now." That was 3 nights ago. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since. My name is Walt, and if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be curled up in the cab of my truck in November in Connecticut with nothing but a duffel bag and a thermos of cold coffee, I would have laughed. I'd spent 31 years as a licensed electrician, mostly commercial work, schools, hospitals, a few government contracts. I retired at 56 with a decent pension, a paid-off house in Bristol, and the honest belief that I had done right by my family. I sold the house 8 months before all of this happened. That was my first mistake, and I made it out of love. My daughter Natalie had been after me for 2 years to move closer to her. She and her husband Kyle lived in Fairfield County, about 40 minutes from where I'd spent most of my life. Their house was nice. Too nice, honestly, for what Kyle made as a mid-level marketing manager. But Natalie had always had expensive taste, and I'd always been the one who quietly made that possible. She called me one Sunday afternoon, and I remember it was raining and I was watching a football game I didn't care about. She said they found a property nearby, a small 2-bedroom cottage about a mile from their house. It needed work, but it had good bones. The sellers wanted $310,000. The market was moving fast. Papa would be so perfect, you'd be close by. You could see the grandkids whenever you wanted. We had 2 grandchildren then, a 4-year-old named Sophie and a 2-year-old named Bryce. I asked how much they needed from me. She paused. Just a beat too long, $250. We could cover the rest with a small loan, but the bank wants us to show more liquid assets at closing. $250,000. It was most of what I had from the house sale. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 days. Then I wired the money. I never moved into the cottage. That's the part that's hard to explain without sounding like a fool, because looking back, I was one. There was always a reason. It needed a new roof first. Then the permit for the addition was delayed. Then Kyle said they were in talks with the contractor, and it would just be another couple months. The months added up. I was renting a room from an old coworker in Bristol, telling myself it was temporary, watching my savings shrink on a fixed income. 7 months in, Natalie stopped answering my calls on the first ring, started letting them go to voicemail. When I drove by the cottage one Saturday afternoon just to check on the progress, I saw a dumpster in the driveway and 2 contractors going in and out. The work was happening. My money was paying for it. I just hadn't been invited to see it. I called her that night and asked directly when I could move in. She said Kyle was going to call me. Kyle never called. 3 weeks later, my pension administrator contacted me about a discrepancy in my direct deposit information. Someone had submitted a change of address and banking update using a power of attorney I had never signed. The money hadn't been redirected yet. The administrator had flagged it before anything went through, but the attempt had been made. I didn't want to believe what I was looking at. I drove to Natalie's house on a Tuesday evening in November. I had my duffel bag in the truck because I'd given up the room in Bristol that morning. The timing was stupid, I know. But I thought surely, whatever this mess was about, the pension paperwork, surely she would explain it and it would make sense, and I could come inside and have dinner with my grandchildren. Kyle answered the door. He was in a collared shirt and he looked at me the way you look at a delivery driver who's knocked on the wrong house. "Walt," he said, "not Dad." "Walt," he dad. "I need to talk to Natalie," I said. She appeared behind him. She was dressed nicely, like they'd been about to go somewhere. She looked at the duffel bag in my hand and something shifted in her face. Not guilt. Annoyance. "Papa, you should have called." "I did call for 3 weeks. Kyle put his hand on the doorframe, not blocking me exactly, but making the geometry of the situation clear. "This isn't a great time," he said. I told him about the pension paperwork, about the power of attorney I'd never signed. Natalie's expression didn't change the way it should have. It stayed careful and controlled, and that scared me more than anything else could have. "I don't know anything about that," she said. "Kyle handles most of our financial stuff." Kyle said, "I think there might have been some confusion with our accountant." Their accountant. My pension. I asked if I could come in. I said I just needed a place to stay for a few days while I sorted things out. I was her father. I'd given her $250,000 8 months ago. Natalie looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at Natalie. Papa, she said, and her voice was so even it didn't sound like her. Kyle and I talked about it. We just can't do this right now. I'm sorry. She closed the door. I stood on the porch for a long time, long enough that the motion sensor light clicked off. I walked back to my truck in the dark, sat down in the driver's seat, and stared at the steering wheel until the windows fogged up. That was how I ended up in a Cracker Barrel parking lot 3 days later, waking up at 4 a.m. with a bad back and $63 in my wallet. I was sitting there watching the sky go from black to gray when a car pulled up next to me. Not a car, a black Lincoln Town Car. The kind that looks like it idles in a different tax bracket. An older man got out, maybe mid-70s, in a coat that probably cost more than my truck. He walked up to my window and knocked. I rolled it down. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Are you Walter Grady?" I hadn't been called by my full name in years. "Yeah," I said. "Who's asking?" "My name is Raymond Fisk. I'm the personal attorney for a man named Charles Alderton. Mr. Alderton has been trying to reach you for several days. He asked me to find you personally. He says it's urgent." Charles Alderton. The name moved through me like a cold draft through a cracked window. I hadn't thought about Charles Alderton in 20 years. He was the owner of Alderton Electric and Systems, the company where I'd gotten my first real job at 23. He'd been in his late 40s then, hard and exacting, the kind of foreman who didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. I'd worked for him for 4 years before moving to a union shop with better benefits. I left on good terms. We shook hands. I never looked back. "Is he all right?" I asked. Raymond's expression answered before his words did. "He's in hospice at Yale New Haven Hospital. He's been asking for you specifically. He says there are matters related to his estate that require your presence." I looked down at myself. 3 days in the same jeans, an old flannel that smelled like fast food. "I'm not exactly. Mr. Alderton anticipated that," Raymond said carefully. "He asked me to tell you that your circumstances don't matter to him, only that you come." I went. The hospice wing at Yale New Haven was quiet in the way hospitals are at 5 in the morning. Not peaceful exactly, just suspended. Raymond led me through a corridor with soft lighting to a private room at the end. The man in the bed was small in the way that illness makes people small, like something essential had been slowly removed. But his eyes, when they opened, were exactly as I remembered them. Sharp, brown, missing nothing. "Walt," he said, and smiled like I'd just shown up on time to a job site. "Sit down. We've got things to talk about." I sat. "Mr. Alderton, Charles," he said. He'd always corrected me on that. I asked him why he'd been looking for me. He said, "Because I owe you something, and because what's happening to you right now is partly my fault." I didn't understand either of those statements. He started from the beginning. In 1993, I was 24 years old and working a commercial retrofit job on a 3-story office building in New Haven. It was a hot July, and we were running conduit on the 2nd floor when I heard a sound from the stairwell. Not a crash, more of a collapse, something heavy and sudden. I went to check. Charles was at the bottom of the stairs. He'd had a cardiac episode and gone down hard. He was conscious but gray, and the job site was 3 blocks from the nearest firehouse. I kept him conscious, called 911, kept the airway clear. The paramedic said later that if he'd been alone another 10 minutes it would have been a different story. I'd thought about that day maybe 4 times in the last 30 years. Not out of modesty. It just hadn't seemed like something that required ongoing attention. A person needed help. I helped. That was it. Charles saw it differently. "I've been watching your life from a distance for 22 years, he said. "Not intrusively, but I've kept track. I knew about your union work, your retirement, your daughter." He let that word sit there for a moment. "I know what she and her husband have been doing, Walt." He opened a folder on the rolling tray beside his bed and handed me a document. It was a copy of the forged power of attorney that had been submitted to my pension administrator. At the bottom, Natalie's signature was clear. Next to it, a notary stamp. The same notary I would later learn who handled Kyle's LLC filings. I stared at it. "How do you have this?" "Because I hired someone to get it," Charles said quietly. 3 months ago, when I started getting my affairs in order, I asked my investigator to look into your daughter's financial situation. I had reasons to be concerned." The reasons were in the next folder. Natalie and Kyle had been living on manufactured credit for 4 years. The house in Fairfield County, the one that was always too nice, carried a mortgage they could not service on Kyle's salary alone. They had 3 credit cards collectively near their limits. Kyle had borrowed against a whole life insurance policy when the bank denied them a home equity line 8 months ago. That was when Natalie called me about the cottage. The $250,000 I'd wired wasn't for a cottage. It had gone straight into their joint checking account, and from there into 12 different payments, credit card minimums, a car payment that was 4 months behind, and a $40,000 lump sum to a creditor I didn't recognize. I sat there absorbing this. It was one thing to suspect. It was something else to see account numbers and transfer dates on paper. "The cottage?" I asked. "The renovation is real," Charles said, "but it was always intended to be an investment property. They've already had a realtor assess it. They plan to sell it in the spring. With my money, my retirement money, the money I'd worked union scale for 31 years to save. The pension attempt," Charles continued, "was Kyle's idea. Natalie went along with it. If the administrator hadn't flagged the change request, you would have lost that income stream permanently." I tried to find a version of this where I was misunderstanding something, where there was a different explanation. There wasn't one. "What else?" I asked. I could tell from his face there was more. Charles reached for a third document. "Your daughter has been telling people in her social circle that you're not well, cognitively." I looked up. "Nothing formal yet, but she's had 2 conversations, both recorded by my investigator, in which she described you as declining and unable to manage his own affairs. She mentioned to one friend that she was looking into options for your long-term care. Guardianship. She was building the groundwork for guardianship. With control over my finances already established through the forged power of attorney, all she would have needed next was a sympathetic doctor's evaluation and a cooperative attorney. I would have been, for all practical purposes, erased. "She's my daughter," I said. It was the only thing I could say. Charles nodded slowly. "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry, Walt, because I believe she learned this behavior somewhere, and I've spent 20 years wondering whether the comfort I quietly arranged for your family contributed to the person she became." I looked at him. He had been the reason 2 of my largest union contracts had come my way in the late 90s. I'd always assumed it was my reputation. It was. But Charles had made the initial introductions. He'd also anonymously covered the deductible gap when I had a workers' comp dispute in 2004 that I nearly lost. He'd done it through a third party, and I'd never known. He said, "I helped make your life easier than it might have been. In doing that, I may have helped make Natalie's life easier than it should have been. She never learned what it cost." We sat in silence for a while. Then he told me why he'd actually sent Raymond to find me. Charles Alderton had no spouse, no children, and no surviving siblings. He had a niece in Phoenix he hadn't spoken to in 11 years, and a former business partner who defrauded him in 2009. His estate, including the sale of Alderton Electric and Systems to a regional contractor 5 years earlier, plus a commercial property portfolio in New Haven County, was valued at approximately $11 million. He was leaving it to me. I told him that was insane. He told me he'd had Raymond prepare the relevant documents for the past 4 months, and that his mental competency had been evaluated by 2 independent physicians, neither of whom were affiliated with Yale New Haven. He said, "I've thought about this more carefully than I've thought about anything in my life. You are the only person I trust to use this money for something worth doing." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "I mean that Natalie and Kyle need to understand what they almost did, and you are the only one who can make that happen properly." He handed me the last document in the folder. It was a 1-page summary prepared by his attorney. Charles had been quietly acquiring assets for the past 4 months. He now held the mortgage on Natalie and Kyle's house in Fairfield County through a Delaware LLC. He held the collection rights on $87,000 of their credit card debt through a second entity, and he had formally retained Raymond Fisk to serve as executor and transition attorney with a single instruction: ensure that Walter Grady has every tool he needs. I signed the will as a witness that morning, with a night nurse and Raymond present. Charles Alderton died 9 days later. I was not in the room. I was in a motel in West Haven, going through boxes of documents with Raymond and trying to understand the scope of what I'd just inherited. When Raymond called to tell me Charles was gone, I sat on the edge of the motel bed and stared at the wall for a long time. I'd met this man twice. Once as a frightened 24-year-old who didn't know if he was keeping his boss alive long enough for the ambulance to arrive, and once as a 58-year-old with $60 in his wallet and nowhere to sleep. He had remembered me both times more clearly than I had remembered myself. The estate cleared probate in 11 weeks. Charles had prepared for every challenge. His niece filed a claim, as Raymond had predicted. It was dismissed in 3 weeks. The former business partner sent a letter. Raymond sent one back that apparently settled the matter the same afternoon. I didn't touch the money for 2 months. I kept staying in the motel. I kept wearing the same rotation of clothes. Part of it was that I needed time to understand what had happened. Part of it was that I was working on something. Raymond and I spent those 2 months reviewing everything Charles's investigator had documented. The full scope of what Natalie and Kyle had done was worse than the initial summary. Beyond the $250,000 and the pension attempt, Kyle had used my name and social security number, obtained, I later learned, from a document Natalie had photographed at my kitchen table 2 Thanksgivings ago, to open 2 utility accounts in a rental property he was trying to flip. When those accounts went delinquent, the damage went to my credit, not his. My credit score, which had never dropped below 780 in my adult life, was now sitting at 609. Natalie had also borrowed $18,000 from my sister, my only sibling, telling her it was on my behalf that I was too proud to ask directly. My sister had given her the money and said nothing to me out of respect for what she thought was my privacy. That one hurt in a way the money didn't. On a Thursday evening in late February, I drove to Natalie and Kyle's house. Not in my truck. In a rented Cadillac Escalade, because Raymond had suggested the visual would be instructive, and he was not wrong about these things. Raymond sat in the passenger seat. He'd agreed to come not as my attorney, but as my witness. I rang the doorbell. Kyle answered. He was in weekend clothes, holding a glass of something amber. He looked at the Escalade in the driveway and then at me, and I watched the sequence of his confusion. Who is this? Wait, that's... Then the color leaving his face. Walt, he said. Evening, I said. Is Natalie home? She appeared behind him within 30 seconds, which told me he'd signaled her somehow, a look or a word I hadn't caught. She was dressed casually, no makeup, and she looked younger and more afraid than I'd seen her since she was a teenager who'd crashed my truck into a mailbox at 17. Papa, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word. I'd like to come in, I said. It won't take long. Kyle stepped back. I don't think it was a conscious decision. I think his body just made the calculation before his brain did. We sat in their living room, the one I'd never been invited into properly, the one with the furniture they couldn't afford, on the street they'd bought with money I'd earned. I noticed there were no photographs of me anywhere. Not one. I'd been removed so thoroughly it was almost architectural. Raymond set his briefcase on the coffee table and began placing documents in front of them. The first was the mortgage note. Kyle picked it up, read the LLC name, read the transfer date, set it down. His hand was steady, but his jaw wasn't. The second was the credit card collection rights summary. The third was a letter from my sister, handwritten, which she had agreed to provide after I'd called her and told her everything. In it, she described the conversation with Natalie, the $18,000, the claim that it was on my behalf. Natalie read that one and put it face down on the table. I said, I want to make sure we're all understanding the same situation. That mortgage note means I hold the debt on this house. The LLC is mine. If I instruct Raymond to initiate foreclosure proceedings, that process begins within 30 days. Your credit rating will not survive it, and neither will your ability to obtain another mortgage in this market. Kyle said, You can't be serious. The credit card accounts, I continued, are also mine. I can call those balances due immediately. Combined with the foreclosure, you'd be looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. Natalie was crying, quietly, with her hands flat on her knees. I also have the documentation on the forged power of attorney, I said, and the pension submission, and the utility accounts open in my name. And Kyle, your social security number appears on 2 of those accounts alongside mine, which means you signed something at some point in that process. Kyle looked at his wife. She didn't look back. The DA's office handles elder financial abuse cases, Raymond said calmly. Connecticut statutes carry felony classification for the specific conduct documented here. The room was very quiet. I looked at my daughter. I had held her when she was 4 hours old. I had coached her soccer team for 3 years because nobody else would. I had sat up with her until 2 in the morning when her first serious boyfriend broke her heart at 19 and had not once told her he wasn't worth it, even though he obviously wasn't. I had given her $250,000 that I could not get back. She was 34 years old and she was sitting across from me with tears running down her face, and I was deciding what kind of father I still wanted to be. "I'm not here to destroy you," I said. "If I wanted to do that, I'd have had Raymond file papers last month and you'd have found out when the notice arrived. I'm here because you are still my daughter, and because Sophie and Bryce are still my grandchildren, and I am not willing to let this be the end of our family. But I need you to understand something first." I leaned forward. "You treated me like I was already gone, like my life was a resource you were entitled to manage. Your mother worked herself to exhaustion for 20 years, and when she died, I took every dollar she left and every dollar I saved, and I used it to make sure you had a better start than we did. And you looked at all of that and decided it still wasn't enough, that you needed more and faster, and that the best way to get it was to erase me while I was still standing here." Kyle put his face in his hands. Natalie said, "Papa, I don't know how," and then stopped. She started again. "I don't know how it got this far. It started as Kyle's idea, but I didn't stop it. I should have stopped it. I kept telling myself we'd pay it back before you noticed." "When?" I asked. "When were you going to pay it back?" She didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer. The plan had never included paying it back. The plan had included a guardianship application and a power of attorney and an old man who wouldn't be in a position to ask questions. I said, "Raymond is going to explain the terms I'm offering. You have until tomorrow evening to decide." Raymond opened a second set of documents. The cottage would be signed over to me immediately and listed for sale. The proceeds would go toward the $250,000 they owed me, with the remainder covered over time. They would execute a formal repayment agreement, notarized and filed, for the balance and for my sister's $18,000. Kyle would contact the utility companies and have those accounts corrected in writing and provide me documentation that it had been done. They would both write a letter, not typed, handwritten, to my sister, explaining what they'd actually done with her money, and every month, for as long as the repayment agreement was in effect, Natalie would call me. Not text, call. And we would actually talk, about her life and the kids and whatever was happening, the way a daughter calls a father because she wants to hear his voice. That last item wasn't in any document. I just said it out loud. Kyle looked up from the papers. "That's it? No criminal charges?" "If you sign and comply," Raymond said, "and there are no further incidents, then no. Mr. Grady has no interest in prosecution. He has interest in resolution." Kyle said, "And if we don't sign?" I said. "Then Raymond files the foreclosure notice in the morning and I send the pension documentation to the state attorney's office by noon." They signed that evening. It's been 8 months since that night. The cottage sold in April for $340,000, which covered the majority of what they owed me. Kyle corrected the utility accounts in February, and I have the documentation. My sister received her letter in March. She called me after she read it, and she cried, and then I cried, and we agreed to have dinner every other Sunday, which we have actually been doing. My credit score is back above 740. I live in a small place in Guilford now, about a mile from the water. I bought it with a portion of Charles's estate. It's modest, and it's mine, and nobody has a key to it except me and Raymond, who keeps a spare in case I ever lock myself out, which has already happened once. Natalie calls on Sundays. Not every Sunday, maybe 3 out of 4. The first few months, the calls were short and careful, like we were both walking on a floor we weren't sure would hold. Lately, they've been longer. Sophie got into a gymnastics program. Bryce has decided he hates naps, which Natalie relays with the exhausted humor of a woman who has not slept properly in 2 years. And I recognize that voice because it's the voice she used when she was little and overtired and fighting it with everything she had. I don't know if I trust her the way I did before. I'm not sure I should. But I know she's my daughter. I know she made choices that nearly ended my life as I understood it. And I know she has to live with that the same way I have to live, with the fact that I missed something in how I raised her. Some lesson about what things cost and what they mean. Charles Alderton saved my life the same way I saved his, not with anything dramatic, just by showing up at the right moment with exactly what was needed. I think about it more than I expected to. I think about the 30 years between that job site in New Haven and that hospital room, all the quiet ways he'd kept a hand on the situation without ever making it about himself. I bought a workbench for the garage in December, started doing small electrical repairs for neighbors, the way I used to do on weekends before I retired. Nothing commercial, no permits, just favors. It turns out that's what I missed most about working. Not the money or the structure. The part where someone had a problem and you had the skills and at the end of the afternoon the lights came on. I've been thinking about what I want the rest of my life to look like, and the answer keeps coming back to something simple. I want to be useful. I want to be honest. I want to sit across from my grandchildren someday and be the kind of grandfather they'll think about when they're grown and facing something hard. The rest of it, the money, the property, the legal arrangements and the signed agreements, it's all just scaffolding. You put it up so the real structure can stand. But scaffolding isn't the building. I'm still figuring out what the building is. But for the first time in a long time, I think I've got enough to work with. I've thought a lot about what actually went wrong, not just with Natalie and Kyle, but with me. Because if I'm being honest, I was part of how this happened. I gave my daughter everything I could for as long as I can remember, and I never once made her feel what it cost. Not because I wanted credit. I didn't. I just thought love worked that way. You give, and the other person grows, and somewhere down the line they understand. What I didn't account for was that people don't automatically understand what they never had to earn. I handed Natalie a cushion every time life got uncomfortable, and in doing that, I accidentally taught her that cushions just appear. That's not her fault entirely. That's mine. There's a version of events where I stay angry about that, where I spend my 60s bitter at a daughter who tried to erase me, and a son-in-law who used my social security number like it was a convenience. I understand that version. I felt it in that Cracker Barrel parking lot at 4 a.m. when the cold had gotten into my back and I was trying to remember the last time anyone had asked how I was doing. But here's what I kept coming back to. Every choice Natalie and Kyle made had a consequence they didn't account for, because they'd been operating in a world where consequences got quietly smoothed over. Kyle borrowed against things he didn't own and assumed the bill would never come due. Natalie told people I was declining cognitively and assumed I'd never find out. They forged my signature on legal documents and assumed the administrator would just process it. The whole scheme was built on the assumption that nothing would push back. Charles Alderton was the pushback, and I think what moved me most about him, in those 9 days before he died, was that he never framed what he was doing as revenge. He called it education through consequences. He believed, and I've come to believe it too, that the most useful thing you can do for someone who has acted without integrity is to make the cost of that choice real and unavoidable, not to destroy them. Just to ensure they can't pretend it didn't happen. That's what the signed agreement was. That's what the monthly calls are. Not punishment for its own sake. Accountability with an exit ramp. You can earn your way back, but you have to actually walk the road. Natalie called 2 Sundays ago and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Sophie lost a tooth. Bryce has started asking questions about where the sky ends, which apparently nobody in their house can answer satisfactorily. She laughed at the end of the call, a real laugh, unguarded, and I sat with the phone in my hand after we hung up and thought about how long it had been since I'd heard that. I don't know if trust fully comes back. Maybe it comes back in a different shape. Maybe that's enough. What I know is this. The 3 things that actually got me through. The ethics to not become what had been done to me. The clarity to understand what had really happened, and the stubbornness to still be standing when the smoke cleared. Those weren't gifts. I worked for them the same way I worked for every dollar I ever earned. Nobody handed me my integrity when I was sitting in that truck with $60 in a cold thermos. I just refused to put it down. That's the only lesson I've got. Hold on to the thing that makes you worth something to yourself. Everything else is negotiable.